The first bark was a crack in the sacred silence of Arlington Cemetery. It wasn't an aggressive sound, but a desperate, pleading cry that made the hundreds of mourners flinch. A scruffy German shepherd, seemingly materialized from thin air, was circling a newly lowered casket, its nose pressed against the polished wood, its paws scratching at the fresh earth as if trying to claw its way to the soldier within. From his post, Sergeant Elias Vance watched. Every fiber of his being, every second of his brutal training, screamed at him to remain a machine. 21 steps. Turn. Hold for 21 seconds. His world was the 63-foot rubber mat and the hallowed marble of the tomb of the unknown soldier. He was a symbol, not a man. But this was different. This wasn't just noise, it was a message. A voice dripping with arrogance cut through the air. For God's sake, can someone get that mangy thing out of here? It's a funeral, not a dog park. Councilman Sterling, a man whose expensive suit was a poor shield for his ugly soul, gestured dismissively at the grieving animal. The crowd saw a stray dog disrespecting a soldier's final rest. The politician saw a nuisance, but Sergeant Vance, a man who had stared death in the face in the deserts of Afghanistan, saw something else entirely. He saw a loyalty so profound it defied logic, a grief so pure it seemed to have crossed miles. To pay its final respects, the dog wasn't barking at the casket. It was speaking for it. Everyone expected the guard to continue his robotic march, a silent monument to the fallen. They believed his duty was to the tomb alone. But in that moment, the world was about to learn that a tomb guard's true duty is to the honor of the soul laid to rest. And the miracle that dog was desperately trying to reveal. To understand Sergeant Elias Vance had to understand the ghost that walked beside him on every one of his 21 steps. The ghost's name was Leo. They had joined the army together. Two boys from a small town with big ideas about changing the world. In the dust-choked chaos of Kandahar, they had been inseparable. Their world had been reduced to the bond they shared, a lifeline in a sea of violence. That lifeline was severed by an IED that stole Leo's life and left Elias with a crater in his soul. He had returned home with a medal for valor and a silence that worried his family more than any physical scar. The noise of civilian life was unbearable. Laughter felt like a betrayal, traffic like an assault. He found his only solace in structure, in discipline so absolute it could quiet the screaming in his head. That was why he'd applied for the most demanding post in the entire U.S. military, a sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The training was brutal. Every crease in his uniform had to be perfect. Every step, every count, every microscopic gesture was scrutinized. He had to master the art of being a living monument, a symbol of a nation's gratitude. For Elias, it was more than a duty. It was penance. It was a way to stand guard for the friend he couldn't save. He was not just guarding the unknowns. He was guarding Leo, his antagonist. Councilman Richard Sterling saw the world not in terms of honor, but in acres and zoning permits. Arlington to him was not sacred ground. It was prime real estate bordering the capital, its solemnity an obstacle to his next luxury condominium project. He was attending the funeral of a distant political ally, not out of respect, but for the photo opportunity. He saw the traditions of the military as antiquated and inefficient. The tomb guards, in their pageantry, were particularly irritating, a symbol of what he considered a wasteful obsession with the past. He believed in progress, a future paved over with concrete and glass, and he had no patience for the ghosts of history. The location itself was a character in this drama. Arlington National Cemetery, a rolling expanse of green hills dotted with white stones, was America's most sacred shrine. It was a place where the weight of sacrifice was palpable. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper the names of the fallen. For a conflict to erupt here was not just a breach of decorum, it was a sacrilege. And as the barking dog and the sneering politician created a vortex of disrespect, Elias Vance stood as the final silent guardian between the sacred and the profane. He was a man who had fled the chaos of war only to find it seeking him out on the most peaceful ground he had ever known. The conflict began as a slow burn. Councilman Sterling, irritated by the delay and the incessant barking, took out his phone. His voice, artificially loud and self-important, cut through the air. "Yes, I'm still at this thing, dragging on forever. Listen, about the Henderson property, tell them my offer is final." A few veterans in the crowd, their backs ramrod straight, shot in glares that could melt steel. A young mother instinctively pulled her daughter closer, shielding her from the man's casual blasphemy. The journalists, initially there to cover the dignitary's funeral, began to slowly turn their cameras away from the casket and toward the unfolding spectacle. The German shepherd, meanwhile, was growing more distressed. It wasn't an aggressive barking, but a mournful, pleading sound. It whined, scratched at the grass near the grave, and then let out another series of barks directed at the casket, as if trying to wake the person inside. Sterling scoffed. Can't someone get rid of that flea-bitten mutt? It's ruining the whole atmosphere. Sergeant Elias Vance's world had shrunk to the 63-foot rubber mat of his patrol. He registered the sounds, the barking, the politician's grating voice, the murmurs of the crowd, but they were external pressures on the fortress of his discipline. His focus was absolute. 21 steps south, click, turn, face east for 21 seconds. His breathing was measured, his mind clear. He was a dam holding back a flood of chaos, and he would not break. His stillness was his defiance. He did not need to shout to show his strength. His silent, perfect execution of his duty was a roaring condemnation of Sterling's disrespect. The councilman, however, interpreted this stoicism as weakness. He saw a man on autopilot, a toy soldier. He took a step off the designated pathway, encroaching closer to the burial site, gesturing with his phone for emphasis. Look, I don't have all day, he said, now addressing his aide but performing for the crowd. There are more important things to do than stand around watching a dog have a fit. Each word was a stone thrown at the stained glass window of the ceremony. The crowd's anger was now a low hum, a palpable energy in the air. The veterans' hands were clenched into fists. Reporters were now fully recording the scene, recognizing that the real story was no longer the deceased, but the living desecration taking place, and through it all, Sergeant Vance marched on, a silent sentinel, his every step a heartbeat of the nation's promise to never forget. But the pressure was building, and the dam was about to be tested. The line was crossed, not with a shout, but with a shout. Enraged that his presence wasn't commanding the attention he felt he deserved, and furious at the dog that was him, Councilman Sterling strode forward. He moved past the honor guard, past the grieving family, and directly toward the barking dog. Get out of here, you stupid animal, he snarled. He didn't kick the dog, but he used his expensive leather shoe to shove its flank, trying to push it away from the grave. In that instant, everything changed. By touching the dog, by physically imposing his will within the sacred perimeter of the burial, Sterling hadn't just crossed a line of respect. He had stepped onto Sergeant Vance's battlefield. Vance was halfway through his 21-step count. He stopped. It was a cessation of movement so abrupt and so absolute that it felt like the world had stopped turning on its axis. He was not programmed to stop mid-patrol. It was a violation of his sacred routine. For a split second, the crowd thought he might have faltered. Then, with a speed that was terrifying in its precision, he moved. He didn't walk, he flowed. In a single fluid motion, he pivoted on his heel and brought his M14 rifle from his shoulder to the port arms position, the weapon held diagonally across his chest. The snap of the leather sling and the click of his heels on the pavement were like cracks of thunder in the dead silence. He took 2 booming steps forward, placing himself directly between Councilman Sterling and the grave. He was no longer a monument, he was a warrior. His eyes, which had been fixed on the horizon, were now locked onto Sterling. They were not angry, they were not hateful, they were filled with an intensity as cold and deep as the marble of the tomb he guarded. The world went utterly quiet. The dog stopped barking. The crowd stopped breathing. Every camera was fixed on the 2 men. Then, Sergeant Vance's voice, a blade of sound honed by months of disciplined silence, cut through the air. It was not a yell, but a command that vibrated in the chest of every person there. It is requested that all visitors maintain a level of silence and respect. The phrase was protocol, but the way he said it was not. It was an order, a warning, and a condemnation, all in one. The air crackled with the force of his words. Councilman Sterling, who had built a career on bullying and bluster, froze. His face went pale, his arrogance evaporating like mist. He had pushed a monument, and the monument had pushed back with the full, unyielding weight of the nation it represented. The crowd let out a collective, audible gasp. They had come to witness a ceremony of honor and were now witnessing its ultimate defense. In the deafening silence that followed Sergeant Vance's command, the German shepherd did something no one expected. The fear and agitation fell away from it. It let out a soft whine, took a few steps to the head of the casket, and lay down. Placing one paw gently on the polished mahogany, it rested its head on its paws, its eyes closing as if in mourning. This single, heartbreaking gesture broke the spell. From the crowd, an elderly man in a wheelchair, his face etched with grief, began to move forward, assisted by a younger woman. He pointed a trembling finger at the dog. Buster. he whispered, his voice cracking. That's Buster. A journalist, sensing the story had just deepened, moved closer. Sir, you know this dog? The old man nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He was the father of the soldier being buried. He was my son's dog, from his first tour. When we got the news about Leo, Buster just disappeared. We searched for weeks. We thought he'd run off to die of a broken heart. The revelation washed over the crowd in a wave of emotion. The dog wasn't a stray, he wasn't a nuisance. He had traveled who knows how far, guided by an instinct no one could explain, to find his master for one final goodbye. The miracle wasn't supernatural. It was a testament to a loyalty that transcended even death. Councilman Sterling stood completely exposed. His petty act of disrespect was now framed against a backdrop of profound, heartbreaking love. The cameras, which had been on him and the guard, now panned to the grieving father and the faithful dog. Sterling's face contorted with humiliation as he realized he was no longer a powerful man being inconvenienced. He was the villain in a story that would be on every news channel by evening. 2 military police officers materialized, their presence firm but quiet. They flanked the councilman. Sir, one said in a low, non-negotiable tone, we think it's time for you to leave. Humiliated and utterly defeated, Sterling was escorted away, his political career effectively ending in a silent walk of shame. Sergeant Elias Vance held his position for another second, ensuring the threat was neutralized. Then, with the same impossible precision, he spun the rifle back onto his shoulder, clicked his heels, and resumed his patrol from the exact point he had stopped. 21 steps. Turn. Face the tomb. He was a monument once more. His actions had spoken for him, for the tomb, and for the fallen. Discipline had conquered chaos. The moment was captured by a dozen cameras, an image of unwavering duty that would become instantly iconic. Hours later, after his shift had ended and the sun had begun to dip below the Virginia hills, Elias stood in the stark quiet of the barracks. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the familiar ache of memory. There was a soft knock on his door. It was his commanding officer, a colonel with kind eyes and a chest full of ribbons. The colonel didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Elias, his gaze filled with a profound respect. You upheld the highest standards of this guard, Sergeant. You made us all proud. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder for a moment, then gave a slow, deliberate salute. Elias returned it, the gesture feeling heavier, more meaningful than ever before. As the colonel left, Elias recalled a moment from earlier, as the crowd was dispersing. The young mother he'd noticed had guided her daughter toward him. The little girl, no older than 6, who had earlier hidden behind her mother's leg in fear of the commotion, now looked at him with wide, wonder-filled eyes. She took a hesitant step forward and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Thank you, Mr. Hero." Now, alone, Elias walked over to his footlocker. He reached inside and pulled out a small, tarnished object, Leo's dog tag. He had carried it with him every day since Kandahar. He ran his thumb over the embossed letters of his friend's name. For the first time, holding it didn't just feel like carrying a burden of loss. Today, he hadn't just guarded the tomb of an unknown. He had stood guard for his friend, Leo. He had protected the dignity of his final rest and stood as a shield for the loyal companion he had left behind. A small, sad smile touched Elias's lips. He had kept his promise. The silence he had cultivated to numb his pain had become the voice of honor, a voice that had echoed across the world. In a world that screams for attention, we are sometimes taught that stillness is weakness and tradition is a relic of the past. But on that day, under the watchful eyes of history, Sergeant Elias Vance and a loyal dog named Buster taught us a different lesson. They reminded us that the deepest traditions are not empty rituals. They are the bedrock of our character. They showed us that true strength is not found in the volume of your voice, but in the conviction of your silence. Elias Vance's discipline was forged in the fires of personal loss, a quiet promise to a fallen friend. That same discipline became a shield for a nation's honor, proving that the most powerful statements are often made without saying a word. It is a testament to the idea that heroes do not always ride into battle with trumpets sounding. Sometimes, they just take 21 steps, guarding the memory of those who can no longer guard themselves. They keep the flame of honor alive, one silent, perfect step at a time. If this story of loyalty, honor, and duty moved you, please share it with others. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes among us. Let the world know that stillness is strength, and tradition is the language of respect that should never be forgotten.